Now, here's the thing. Partisan journalism, totally skewed views of events, is kind of an American tradition. We had kind of gone through a period of 70 or 80 years when it wasn't the case, but it came back again. It came back in the Nixon era when cable news started opinionating. It's been thus ever since. And what we think is immediate, frighteningly immediate, felt that way in the George Washington era when newspapers were published twice a week.
Harold Holzer, winner of the 2015 Gilder-Lehrman Lincoln Prize, is one of the country's leading authorities on Abraham Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era. A prolific writer and lecturer and frequent guest on television, Holzer served for 6 years as chairman of the Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation. For the previous 10 years, he co-chaired the U.S. Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, appointed by President Clinton. President Bush awarded Holzer the National Humanities Medal in 2008, and in 2013, Harold wrote an essay on Lincoln for the official program at the re-inauguration of President Obama. He is now co-chairman of the Lincoln Forum. Harold is a good friend of the Vermont Humanities. He has given more than a few riveting talks through our First Wednesday's programs. He's here today to elevate our fall conference theme, Democracy 2020, with a talk on his latest and timely book, The Presidents versus the Press, The Endless Battle Between the White House and the Media. Please join me in welcoming Harold Holzer.
Thank you, Tess. Really regret missing another visit to Vermont because every visit is great. But I appreciate your inviting me to the virtual conference and a discussion of what I guess is one of the messier parts of democracy, and that is enduring the battling that goes on in a once again partisan media, especially in terms of the White House and its pushback against the press and its always close and tense battles and scrutiny of the president. And I guess it couldn't be more timely unless we were still in the midst of a presidential campaign to discuss the White House and the press. As I speak today, but probably will not be the case when we're broadcast, we're still counting votes in a presidential election. So whoever becomes president of the 46th president, if it's a different person than the 45th president, will no doubt be resuming this kind of anticipated conflict that has always existed with those who cover the White House. And when I say always, I really mean always. And I have some images to share with you. And maybe we can go to our first image as I say that the first president who objected to coverage was, guess who? The first president. George Washington was sort of on the longest honeymoon in presidential history. That is, for the first term of George Washington, he was lionized, exalted, revered in much the same way as he had been respected when he was the general commanding revolutionary forces. Something new was added to the mix. If we go to the next slide, I'll tell you exactly how. So Washington had this idyllic period with journalism, probably because his administration had supported the establishment of a pro-federalist newspaper in the national capital of Philadelphia. And they were, of course, reporting all of the successes of the Washington administration and lavishly praising the first president as well. And then Washington's own Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, not a Federalist, but let's call him a Democrat, decided that there really should not be one-party press coverage in the country. So Washington's own Secretary of State attracted the man at the right, Philip Freneau, a Democrat. In fact, he had been James Madison's roommate at college, to journey from New York and set up a Democratic newspaper in Philadelphia to give a different perspective. Well, Freneau established his newspaper. Oh, by the way, Jefferson gave him a $250 a year job, a lot of money in those days, in the State Department. So the State Department was actually subventing Freneau's relocation and existence in Philadelphia. Well, Freneau began criticizing Washington, not only on policy, but on personality, soon joined by another Democratic newspaperman, Benjamin Franklin Bache, who was the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. You can imagine how much that wounded George Washington. So for the next 4 years, they not only criticized Washington on policy matters, but just attacked every aspect of the personality that had been so revered in America. He celebrated his own birthday. He flourished about in fancy carriages. He believed in a monarchical system. Washington just hated it. And one day, Jefferson observed him throwing a newspaper to the ground or to the floor at a cabinet meeting and jumping up and down on it and saying, "What have I done to deserve this kind of criticism? I'd rather be back on the farm." And sure enough, at the end of his second term, Washington decided to retire to Mount Vernon. Now, I know that myth and legend suggest that Washington did so out of a deep sense of national responsibility. He did not want a monarchy in the United States. He did not want a third term. He did not want to encourage a permanent presidency. And he did it out of his reverence for the new republic, stepping down. Well, I think there was more to it, because if you look at his farewell address, not the one that was published ultimately, and it was a newspaper column as opposed to a speech, even though we call it the farewell address, Washington made it clear that one of the chief reasons he was leaving is because he was sick of criticism by the press. And let me read you this lost paragraph. This is Washington. "Some of the gazettes of the United States have teemed with all the invective that disappointment, ignorance of the facts, and malicious falsehoods could invent to misrepresent my politics and affections, to wound my reputation and feelings, and to weaken, if not entirely destroy, that confidence you had been pleased to repose in me." So he didn't just say, "Beware of foreign entanglements." He said, "I'm sick of the partisan press," and he was. Well, his successor, whom you'll see in the next slide, was, of course, John Adams. And John Adams not only pushed back against the same Democratic journalists who had assailed Washington, he did something that, well, it had been thought was expressly forbidden in the Bill of Rights. He signed a federal law that made it a crime to criticize or ridicule the President of the United States, the Sedition Act. And under that law, Adams encouraged his own Attorney General. If this sounds familiar, well, that's the whole point. Everything that's old is new again, or vice versa. Adams encouraged his own Attorney General to go after Democratic newspapers. There were at least 17 show trials during this period from 1797 to 1801. And one of the journalists who was thrown in jail was a man who wrote that pamphlet on the right, The Prospect Before Us. His name was James T. Callender, and he was a Jeffersonian. He loved Jefferson, and he despised Adams. Put in jail in Richmond and fined $500. Keep that in mind as we take a look at the next slide, which shows the aforementioned Thomas Jefferson. And one of the journalists he encouraged, rather a lookalike, don't you think? Thomas Duane. And Duane set up shop as yet another pro-democratic journalist attacking the Federalists. So Jefferson becomes, as Adams actually becomes the first of either 9 or perhaps by the time I'm speaking, 10 American presidents who did not win a second term. Adams is defeated by Jefferson. He gets rid of the Sedition Act, although don't think that Jefferson liked press criticism. He just was such an anti-federalist that he believed that libel prosecutions should occur on the state level. And remember now the man Callender, who I spoke about a minute ago. Well, Jefferson is so upset that Callender has been persecuted that he contributes $50 toward a fund to make up the fine he had to pay, and generally celebrates his release from prison in Richmond. Well, Callender thinks that he deserves a bit more, and he asks Jefferson if he might give him the post of Postmaster General of Richmond. Audacious? Well, in a way, but not a big ask, because for the first 12 years of the Republic, every federal postmaster was a Federalist. It was about time for Jefferson to reward faithful Democrats, many of them newspapermen. But something about Callender's request irritated him. He thought it was presumptuous. He said no. One of the big mistakes that any president ever made in terms of relationship with a journalist. What did Mr. Callender do? Well, number one, he became a pro-Federalist journalist. He founded an anti-Jefferson newspaper. But the other thing he did is he wrote a pamphlet that, for the first time in America, announced a familiar story now, that Thomas Jefferson had been carrying on an illicit affair with his enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, and that there were several children living at Monticello who looked remarkably like Mr. Jefferson. So Jefferson, by not paying enough attention to his obligations to a journalist who had supported him, paid a price in his own time and in history. And that brings us to the fellow in the next slide. I'm showing you Andrew Jackson in caricature, and some of the criticism he engendered. Both of these are by newspaper publications. Newspapers published them. One saying that Andrew Jackson was a royalist, a monarch, a dictator, and the other that he was guilty of crimes. Each of those coffins in the bloody Andrew Jackson poster, quite a famous image of the early 19th century, is supposed to represent a person whom Jackson had killed during his career as a military man, and we're supposed to infer a hothead. Well, Jackson took partisan journalism one step further. He exiled newspapers that didn't approve of him. That is, they got no more government printing contracts, and he befriended newspapers that supported him. If we move up 2 slides, you'll see one of them. Amos Kendall on the left, the editor of the Argus of Western America, came to Washington to become Postmaster General. By the way, one of the things Jackson suggested and Kendall suggested is that perhaps they shouldn't mail so many anti-Jackson newspapers through the post office. Maybe that sounds familiar as well. And on the right, Francis Preston Blair Sr., also imported from the West to found a new pro-Jackson newspaper, the National Globe. He would remain a major figure in Washington for the next 40 years. And by the way, the National Globe got printing contracts from the government and the first dibs at major news. Now we're entering a very partisan age. If you look at the next slide, you'll see Blair in old age. He looks a little bit like a vampire at that point. And on the right, the opposition journalist, William Winston Seaton of the pro-Whig National Intelligencer. So the Whig journalists are ostracized, and they begin violently criticizing Andrew Jackson over all sorts of issues. The Bank of the United States, his antipathy toward infrastructure development. And meanwhile, journalists who are loyal to Jackson, like Kendall, like Frank Blair on the left, were invited to be part of Jackson's kitchen cabinet, informal advisors to the White House. Policymakers. Blair wrote Jackson's veto messages, his election literature. journalism and politics are now, and government are now hand in glove, cogs in the same machine. And that's a tradition that would last for the rest of the 19th century. Practiced as well by the man in the next slide, a man about whom I've written often, Abraham Lincoln. And I show him, I think, instructively with holding one of his favorite newspapers, the Washington Chronicle, as he poses for a photographer on an August Sunday, just a couple of months before delivering the Gettysburg Address. Now, Abraham Lincoln befriended Republican editors, gave them jobs in the administration, also government printing contracts, so many federal appointments to pro-Republican newspapers that a wag of the time joked that if he appointed one more person from the New York Tribune to a government job, that they would no longer be able to publish the paper. The staff had been depleted by patronage. But Lincoln was also quite critical of the Democratic newspapers of the day, as critical as they were of him. During his administration, if we go to the next slide, I'll show you two of them. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln or his government or his army shut down more than 200 newspapers in the border states or in the northern states for doing little more than criticizing enlistment or the draft or the Emancipation Proclamation. Originally, border state papers to make sure that they didn't spread the notion of secession, but also newspapers in New York and New England for criticizing, for advising soldiers not to rejoin the army, for example. By the way, it's clear that these two fellows went to the same photographer. Don't you think? They're even dressed alike, but they couldn't be more different. On the left, Henry Jarvis Raymond, the founder of the openly Republican New York Times. And on the right, Manton Marble, editor of the pro-democratic New York World. How did they fare during the Civil War? Well, Raymond was an influential dispenser of patronage and an advisor to the president. He may have been a little bit unsure of him at the beginning, but afterwards totally loyal. Marble, when the New York World becomes a Democratic paper, is the only person whose newspaper was shut down and its editor, meaning him, arrested on a direct signed order by Abraham Lincoln, merely for printing a proclamation that turned out to be bogus, a presidential executive order. Marble was taken to custody. He very nearly went to Fort Lafayette in Brooklyn Harbor. And in 1864, when Abraham Lincoln ran for re-election, a president who was thought to be rather unpopular, running for a second term, he won. Henry Raymond remained editor of the New York Times, but he was also chairman of the Republican National Committee and a candidate for Congress in Manhattan, a Republican candidate. Talk about journalism and presidential politics mixing. Marble spent part of the campaign in prison, another part of the campaign publishing vicious, racist, anti-Lincoln cartoons and editorials. And by the way, his boss, his publisher, August Belmont, was chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Unimaginable today. Well, maybe not when it comes to Fox and MSNBC, but certainly from the print guys. Here are another two editors worth noting in this next slide. On the left, Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, one of the most influential editors in the country, but a thorn in Lincoln's side and afterwards dropped, but an anti-slavery man whose influence on the Republic, including his admonition or his advice, "Go West, young man," was famous. On the right, James Gordon Bennett, a kind of Rupert Murdoch figure of the day, editor of the most popular paper in the country, the New York Herald, an anti-Lincoln but pro-Union, racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic. He made this extraordinary deal with Lincoln in that same 1864 year. He tempered his criticism, in return for which he was to be offered the ambassadorship to France, which it was known in advance he would decline. Just an arrangement to make him seem respectable. Well, toward the end of the 19th century, something miraculous happened. Political journalism kind of went onto the editorial page, not the news page. And front page journalism, with a little bit of yellow journalism, became the order of the day. No one was more perfect for that moment than the fellow in the next image, Theodore Roosevelt. And there you see him talking to a scrum of reporters, much the same way Mr. Trump talks to reporters on a rope line. The perfect personality for the front page age, because Theodore thought he should be on the front page of every paper every day. The journalists were happy to oblige him. It was TR who created the first White House press room. TR who gave them the first daily opportunities to talk to him off the record while he was being shaved every afternoon. The journalists referred to it as the barber's hour, and they loved it when Roosevelt's face was lathered and his barber was holding the straight-edged razor right at TR's neck. That was the moment when they would always ask him the most difficult question. And he would jump up and raise his arms and throw off the towel that was protecting him from the lather. And the journalists had a little game. They wanted to see if the barber would ever cut his throat, but he never did. It was also the age, as you'll see in this next slide, of long-form investigative journalists who ballasted Roosevelt's progressive proposals with these amazing investigative stories about Standard Oil, the meatpacking industry. These are two of the most famous of those muckrakers, Lincoln Steffens on the left and Ida Tarbell on the right. By the way, Roosevelt was not just a jovial person, he was also pretty tough, because when he got tired of these journalists, it was he who labeled them the muckrakers. We think of it today as a badge of honor, but in fact, Roosevelt meant to say they wallowed too much in the mud. Suing newspapers, does that sound familiar? Well, this next gentleman, Joseph Pulitzer, who you see in the next slide, was a publisher who TR loathed, and he directed his attorney general to launch a libel suit against him for defaming the president. He even made it part of a national presidential address, actually a kind of State of the Union address. And this court went all the way up, this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where it was ultimately dismissed. Very hard to sue a journalist for telling his version of the truth. The next slide shows Woodrow Wilson with his chief aide, Joseph Tumulty, who doubled as a press aide. But as the journalist of the day wrote, if we look at this next slide, covering Wilson after covering Theodore Roosevelt was like going from a foundry to a convent. Wilson was mercurial. He got aggravated at some questions, and even though he held the first organized regular news conferences, at least at the beginning of his administration, the press just never took to him. This is a rare smiling moment. If you look at the next picture, you'll see that the White House Correspondents Association formed when Wilson was president, and there is the president sitting in the middle looking kind of small. Also, the White House Photographers Association. Take a look at them in this next slide. Not quite like the TV guys of today. Tripods, newsreel cameras, and there they are. Wilson took a large group of journalists to Paris for the Paris Peace Conference, by the way. And I tell this story kind of on myself because I wish I had put it in the book. The book was getting long, and I thought I'd cut some things out, including the story about how at Paris, Wilson became ill, but hid it from reporters. He got really ill, and some say close to death with a high fever. What happened? Well, he contacted the Spanish flu. But I thought, who's going to be interested when I finished writing the book? Who's going to be interested in a story about a pandemic? It only happens once in a century. Well, that's apparently what happened, but I was not keen enough to what was coming to include pandemic 1918 in the book. The next gentleman is important in the next slide. This is George Creel posing next to a World War I cannon, a forgotten person in history to some extent. Wilson named him chairman of the Committee on Public Information during World War I, the first massive national exercise in censorship. Creel and his commission would not allow certain information to be released through the press or the radio during World War I, cracked down on dissent, threw the Milwaukee Journal's editor into jail, the Jewish Daily Forward, but in addition to censorship, created what was in fact the first national state propaganda unit. We may joke about state media today. This really was state media. Press releases, magazines, a speakers bureau, a state fair bureau to infiltrate or at least populate state fairs with speakers and literature, pamphlets, people who specialize in giving 90-second speeches in movie theaters during the interval during which projectionists had to change reels for feature films, specialists in pep talks during those precious minute and a half. Posters, the I Want You poster that became so famous as a work of art, all engineered by this innocuous-looking fellow. So if we talk about government influence on the media, think of the Sedition Act under Adams and World War I with Creel. This next shot shows President Franklin Roosevelt walking out of the building where I now have the honor of working when we're open. This is the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute in Manhattan on East 65th Street. Number 47 is the home of Franklin's mother, Sarah Roosevelt, who built this double townhouse. On the right, number 49 is the home of Franklin, and you see in the back, Eleanor. By the way, this photograph, taken in 1933 by the Daily News of New York, was not published. Why? Because it showed the steel braces encircling FDR's shoes and showed him maneuvering to get himself down the stairs by using those muscular arms to sort of leverage himself down the stairs. And that was because there was an extraordinary gentleman's agreement between the photographers and most of the print press never to photograph Roosevelt walking on crutches, sitting in a wheelchair, being lifted from automobiles or taken or put back in automobiles, or descending and ascending from his trains. Why? There's no smoking gun. They liked him. They wanted to give him a fair break. And it was generally agreed that if the extent of his disability was publicized, he would not be elected, much less be empowered to fight the two wars he did survive politically to fight, the war against economic collapse and the war against the fascists. This is the day after Election Day, 1932. We all are going through an election and a process following an election. Well, Herbert Hoover did not exactly concede on election night, even though Roosevelt won almost 40 states, almost all of the states, and a preponderance of electoral votes. So Roosevelt went to his parlor in Roosevelt House, was put in that armchair you see, and with his mother on his left, on his right, our left, his daughter Anna on our right, and his son in the background, he delivered a speech on the radio, a revolutionary thing for a newly elected president. And then he repeated it for the newsreel cameras. If you want to hear this remarkable speech, just go to Roosevelt acceptance speech on YouTube and you will hear it or see it in the newsreel version. He actually did it twice. And he then became an extraordinarily accessible president. 1,000 news conferences in 12 years and 28 fireside chats. This one is not included, even though, as you can see from the background here, he's actually in front of his fireplace at Roosevelt House. If you look at the next slide, you'll see the man who managed the press for Roosevelt, Stephen Early. I always rank him as one of the great press secretaries with a little bit of a caveat. And that is, as the nephew of a Civil War general, Jubal Early, he was pretty hostile to the black press, to blacks in general. Not until 1944, 11 years into the Roosevelt administration, did Early admit an African-American reporter to one of these 998 news conferences. It's really a very dismal record. Early was a white supremacist Southerner, and he helped rule appointments at the White House. Let's take a look at the next slide at the first of these news conferences. Just a couple of days after his 1933 inauguration, Roosevelt would be sitting at his desk. The journalists would crowd around. The door would be locked so nobody could race out and get a scoop. People who wanted to be close were the last ones to get back to the press room to phone in stories. They were off the record, but FDR put a lot of the press conference, a lot of the answers on the record if they were requested. And this was a rolling activity. If you look at the next slide, he could hold a press conference with a celebrity guest at a summit in Tehran. Here he is with Winston Churchill talking to the press during an Allied summit. And if you look at the next shot, here he is at Hyde Park, a jovial moment, an informal moment at the right, laughing with the journalists at his picnic table. But even as he was being accessible, Roosevelt was also going around the press. And if you look at the next shot, you'll see one of those triumphs, the fireside chats. As I say, just 28, but people had the impression that he was on the radio all the time. If we look at the next slide, we'll see one he made in 1940 while he's in mourning for his recently deceased mother. Tremendous impact. The voice was everywhere, and it was perfectly suited for the radio. That's what made them effective. He was just trained and had the right voice, the right volume to be an intimate radio star and newsreel star, by the way. One of the things, the two themes of my book, I guess, are one is that every president has complained about treatment of the press. And for all of his joviality, Roosevelt hated the publishers because they never supported him. A majority never supported him in any of his 4 campaigns. He criticized them to their faces. They just didn't print it. And he was tough. He wouldn't talk about what they wanted him to talk about quite often, but he also went around them. The second theme of my book is that the most brilliant communicators among presidents have been those who found new technological ways of speaking directly to the people without the buffer of the press. Roosevelt was one. The man on the next slide was another. And here he is at one of his first live televised news conferences at the State Department in Washington in this beautiful theater, of course, John F. Kennedy. If you look at the next slide, we'll look at it from the reporter's angle. There is President Kennedy at the right. I hope you can see the right-hand part of that slide that's not covered by me. But here's the president speaking to those audiences. And I still remember as a kid getting home from public school quickly enough that I could hear these press conferences because they became a must-see TV. In the next slide, we see a man who was partly responsible and became the most visible press secretary in American history up to that time, Pierre Salinger, handing the president a note. By the way, that familiar lectern with the seal of the United States was created specifically for President Kennedy's news conferences. In the next slide, you see Salinger close up with President Kennedy at a photo opportunity. I decided to use Kennedy as the cover of my book for a variety of reasons, but I guess a little bit nostalgically because it harkens back to the first president in whom I was interested as an 11-year-old in 1960. But because of the press conferences, to which the press objected at the beginning because they thought it was a theatrical piece, one journalist complained, "This is like watching the president making love in Carnegie Hall." Well, they soon adapted to it because they became pretty famous themselves by asking questions. In this next shot, there are two people I'm sure you'll recognize, John Kennedy on the left and former President Harry Truman visiting in the center. But that woman at the right was pretty famous in her time. She's May Craig, a veteran journalist from the Roosevelt era, one of the few women to cover the White House in Roosevelt's time, who became a fixture at those Kennedy news conferences. Every time Kennedy thought that they were dragging a bit or becoming too immersed in facts, heaven forbid, he would call on May Craig, who was always just amazingly ready to ask a kind of an offbeat question. And all Kennedy had to do was smile at her a little bit condescendingly, and the room would erupt in laughter. And one of her most famous ones is, "What are you doing for the women of this country, Mr. Kennedy?" And he just looked at her and said, "Not enough, Ms. Craig." Kennedy also benefited from having stories untold, as Roosevelt had. Kennedy had been a journalist at the end of World War II, and he had a lot of friends who were journalists and editors. And they not only praised him in the press, but they avoided discussing both his health, which was more seriously impaired than we ever knew at the time, and also his extramarital affairs, which most of them knew about and decided were not worth reporting on. Can you imagine that happening today? Kennedy also tried to control the press. During the Bay of Pigs preparation, we all remember that 1961 invasion, or for those of you who don't remember, it was a failed CIA-backed Cuban landing to liberate Cuba from Fidel Castro. A newspaper threatened to write about it while it was in preparation, and Kennedy and his father pushed back to suppress it. Then after the invasion blew up and failed, Kennedy complained that the press should have advised him that the scheme that had been devised under his predecessor's administration was terrible. And he was pretty rankled at the coverage. And in the next scene, we see him in April of that first year, 1961, in white tie, no less, addressing the American Publishers Association at the Waldorf in New York, telling them, "I was going to call this speech the president's versus the press, because you have to know that national security is more important than freedom of the press." Well, by the way, that's still open to debate. At that time, I was going to call my book The Presidents and the Press, but JFK inspired me to use his title that he discarded, The Presidents versus the Press, because I think it's more accurate. The next slide shows his successor, Lyndon Johnson, trying desperately to be as available and as attractive to the press as John Kennedy, convinced that they never liked him, convinced that they were elitist. As you look at the next slide, he tried everything. Television interviews. He did press conferences, but they were never like Kennedy's. In 1965, he even thought, as you see in the next slide, of inviting journalists to his bedside when he was ill. Even Donald Trump never did that, for an impromptu press conference. But as you see in the next slide, he went one step further. After his gallbladder surgery, he held a press conference at Walter Reed Hospital to show everyone his surgical scar, a picture that went viral, at least by 1965 standards. Johnson had a fraught relationship with the press, really pushed back, and felt totally unappreciated. Here's a little bit of continuum. Franklin D. Roosevelt got a White House pool for his rehabilitation, thanks to the Daily News, which fundraised to build the White House pool. Lyndon Johnson liked to take reporters swimming naked in the White House pool, and drinking in the White House pool, which was kept to about 100 degrees. And as you look at this next slide, this next president, Richard Nixon, seen here with John Chancellor and Nancy Dickerson, got rid of the White House pool and built the White House press room over it. So every time you see a briefing by the White House press secretary, think of FDR and Lyndon Johnson, perhaps not swimming in the White House pool. Well, Richard Nixon came to the presidency with the most hostile relationship with the press. In the next slide, you see him at his famous 1962 news conference after losing a comeback as governor candidate for governor of California, saying, "You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore." He goes, "Gentlemen, this is my last news conference." Well, not only was it not, because he won the presidency 6 years later, but then we saw him in poses like this. The next slide, very much like the other one, bellicose, belligerent. I'm not going to dwell on the obvious, which is that he pushed too far with Watergate, his enemies list, sending Spiro Agnew out to attack journalism and television journalism. And it was the beginning of gotcha journalism. The only comment I'll make, just for lack of time, is that the same fellow who partnered to bring down Richard Nixon, more or less, also wrote the book Fake about Donald Trump not long ago. So the same guy, Bob Woodward, over a span of nearly 50 years, is still out there doing high-degree investigative journalism. Our next president in the next slide, Gerald Ford, amiable enough, lost his press secretary in week one for pardoning Richard Nixon, and that is a young Helen Thomas. You may recognize her at the right. Another White House press corps veteran that I write about in my book. And next you'll see Jimmy Carter, who came with high hopes of being accessible, did a fireside radio broadcast with Walter Cronkite, but the press turned on him as well, mocked his efforts at communication, Roosevelt style. And then one year, in the next slide, in the midst of long gas lines, he took his famous idyllic fishing vacation to Georgia and fought off a killer rabbit, a story that his press secretary, Jody Powell, apparently told a reporter after a few too many drinks in August. I learned as a press secretary, August is the cruelest month because journalists don't have that much to write about. At least it was so 40 years ago. And they wrote President versus Killer Rabbit, and it made something of a mockery of Jimmy Carter, another defeated president. And then came, in the next slide, a communications genius, at least his advisors were. Ronald Reagan would not just mark Physical Fitness Day at the White House, he would demonstrate Physical Fitness Day. In the next slide, you'll see some of the people who are responsible for the image making, and you may recognize the tall man looking at the president. That's David Gergen, who's still a commentator on CNN. Next slide, Reagan introduces radio addresses, although once he said into what he believed was a test microphone, this is the beginning of the war. We bombed Russia in 5 minutes, and it was a live mic. Russia wasn't too happy. And you see that his advisors put up this giant on the air sign so that he wouldn't say anything untoward again. But another communications genius, perhaps masking harsh policy, but establishing boundaries with the press and keeping on message, something that was important in the late 20th century. Nobody had a more fraught and up and down relationship with the press than the next person. This is Bill and Hillary Clinton in their famous 60 Minutes interview in January 1992, fending off rumors of marital infidelity. Hillary famously saying, "I'm not Tammy Wynette standing by my man." Very tough interview, but brilliantly managed. Even if one of those lights you see above them came crashing down on them off camera, and President Clinton actually saved Hillary. He pushed her away in time to be saved. In the next slide, you see Clinton continuing these radio addresses. He hated them because he wanted to play golf, but he did them. He also courted the black press and local regional press, but ultimately, I think the press told too many untruths. And here in the next slide, you'll see his famous, "I did not have sex with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky." Same day as he told my old friend, the late Jim Lehrer of the PBS NewsHour, that the stories were false. These moments are never forgotten because now they're captured live as well as reported on in the media. And sometimes these media moments craft images forever and sustain a president. In the next image, November 14th, 2001, George W. Bush on the rubble of the Twin Towers in Manhattan, telling people that the terrorists would hear from the United States. But in the next image, less than 2 years later, his famous appearance on the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln with the infamous mission accomplished sign behind him long before the mission was accomplished. And with President Bush, who had difficulties with the press, the low point was probably in the next slide, the press conference in Baghdad at which a reporter hurled his shoe at President Bush. In President Bush's defense, he was pretty dexterous and pretty nimble in evading it, and later said, because he had a pretty amazing wit, size 10, I think. A familiar face, looking so young. Barack Obama had many, many news conferences, and yet I was astonished in my research to see how many journalists remember him as a distant, unapproachable president who actually blocked their access, referred them to a new thing called the White House website, wiretapped reporters in search of leakers. So these fraught relationships have persisted in Republican and Democratic administrations. And I was immensely surprised to find such bad memories among journalists, some of whom I know and have interviewed, for President Obama. Well, as I speak, it's November 2020, and this next slide shows November 2016, the early press conferences of the first Trump-Pence campaign. And the next slide, President Trump, who never met a rope line he didn't like talking to journalists. Whatever your political beliefs, I think we have to admit that President Trump ranks with FDR and Kennedy, and perhaps Obama in terms of the website, as presidents who had brilliantly used new technologies to speak directly to the American people. Just look at this next slide. The press is not allowing America to be great again. They are truly the enemies of the people. So raise doubts about objective truth? Yes. Wage a painful law against the free press? Yes. Lie to the American people? 20,000 times over 4 years. But as you'll see in this final slide, unfortunately, it's an American tradition. Presidents, whether they are tweeting or throwing newspapers on the floor and jumping on them, have an invariably tension-filled relationship with the press. And now that we're in a time with cable television and the internet in which there is no consensus on the news, when it's not just a president who is arguing his own version of the truth, but cable TV news as well, Fox on the right, MSNBC and CNN on the left. I think it's incumbent on us as news consumers and as citizens of the United States who elect presidents to look deeply into the news we follow and make our own judgments about what's true and what's not. One thing that is indisputably true, American presidents, no matter when they served, no matter how fraught their administrations or how peaceful, always have done battle with the press. 'Twas ever thus, and in our less anxiety-filled days, we should admit to ourselves it's a pretty healthy tension when it exists at its very best. Thank you.
Did I see May Craig peeking out of the crowd of reporters in the first slide of FDR and the press corps?
Oh, I don't remember, but you may well have seen her. May Craig was in those White House press conferences, And I must say, if you look at the transcripts, as I have, all 998 of them, sometimes he's a little bit, he's no better at treating women reporters than Donald Trump. He said to her, he would tease her. One time she said at the beginning of World War II, a lot of security now, Mr. President. It was very hard to get in here. And he said, May, was it really hard? Did they pat you down? We may have to get a female attendant to pat you down. So a little bit of hijinks. And whatever our image of May Craig as a kind of elderly woman with a flower pot hat in the Kennedy days, she was a pretty tough pioneer and an inspiration to women journalists, because she was out there in the 1930s and 40s covering Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry Truman. So she pops up a few times in my book, not just as a foil for JFK, but as a kind of a good pushback conscience for Franklin Roosevelt.
I had one about if in your research you ran across the Vermonter Matthew Lyon with the Alien and Sedition Act under Adams.
Did I encounter him?
Yeah.
Yeah. Was he one of the persecuted journalists?
He was. He eventually, I'm trying to remember all the circumstances, but he was eventually imprisoned in Vergennes, I believe.
Not only were editors imprisoned, but in the those days of sort of rudimentary medicine, two of the accused that I encountered in my research died before their trials, and their widows who took over the enterprises and hired guys to run the papers were prosecuted in their place. So the widows were fined. I don't think they were imprisoned. And yeah, it was a brutal 4 years. And just think about, and here's another parallel to today. Many progressives are deeply concerned that decisions, legal appeals in the future are going to be adjudicated by a United States Supreme Court that is stacked 6-3 as a conservative court. When these anti-federalist editors came up before federal courts, because they were prosecuted under federal law for federal crimes, the first courts they encountered, the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, was 100% Federalist, because all of them had been appointed by George Washington and John Adams. So imagine the ultimate stacked deck in 1797 to 1801.
Here's a question from Alan. He writes, to some extent you answered this question, but so many of us have been outraged by Trump's rhetoric about alternative facts and fake news. But given the way you've shown the persistence of this type of discourse and given us historical perspective, what would you say is different about Trump?
Where do I start? I'm a New Yorker, so I've experienced Donald Trump from his days as a developer when I worked for the governor of New York, and he was trying to get NBC to move to a new building. But what's different, I think, is the kind of overt and relentless bullying of the press. There's no disguising, there's no occasional outburst. And if you look back at presidents who have pushed back at the press, they did so rarely, making each event, each occasion extraordinarily important, newsworthy, historical, history-worthy. Trump has made the bashing of the press part of his policy. It's an essential key of his policy. But in terms of creating misinformation, he's probably not that much different from others. The other striking difference is that Trump tweets from his bed, or I shudder to think where, every morning, and people read it within seconds. Millions of people read it within seconds. And then his views and his His grievances are debated every afternoon and every evening on Fox and CNN with alternative viewpoints. I think it should be pretty clear to us that half of the country buys into his version of grievance and his version of truth. I don't think we've ever had a more, whatever we thought was going to happen as I speak, we've just come through an election in which 70 million people each voted for Joe Biden and Donald Trump. There's no mandate out there that says that that his rhetoric is unacceptable. And I just think we have to deal with that and fight back with our own interpretations if they're different. And here's the thing, partisan journalism, totally skewed views of events is kind of an American tradition. We had kind of gone through a period of 70 or 80 years when it wasn't the case, but it came back again. It came back in the Nixon era when cable news started opinionating. And that's why Spiro Agnew was sent out to say that this is unacceptable. It's been thus ever since. And what we think is immediate, frighteningly immediate, I think felt that way in the George Washington era when newspapers were published twice a week. And people said, I'm imagining, a newspaper twice every week? This is immediate. This is unbelievably immediate. How can we deal with this onslaught, this bombardment of information? We can't even imagine what presidential communications are going to be like in 20 years. Those of us who get to see it, maybe you remember this. It won't be Twitter. It won't be Instagram. It'll be something that we can't even imagine. Maybe we'll be speaking to our fingernails or our eyeglasses. But again, we've been through this before. And maybe it's more in our faces now, but it's not new in American discourse or American history.
And maybe we'll finish with this last question here.
Okay, make it a great one.
Okay. Karen will ask, where should people get information to think for themselves? Is the information on the front pages still real news? I read blogs from both Republican and Democratic sources, and this creates a potentially confusing vision of reality.
That is a great question. When I lecture in college campuses, in the days when I could, I would always start, especially in a small seminar group, asking where the students get their information. And there are usually senior learners at these sessions. And the senior learners always say the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, even if they're not in New York. And the kids have the most frightening sources. I mean, it's not just that it's Breitbart, which is an openly political source. It's they use the BBC or Agence France Presse because they don't trust any source they get. Look, we're in a period when the news is filtered through political viewpoints again. The best newspapers in the country, I think the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post are political. Maybe not so much in their news coverage, but in their news analysis, in their choice of what stories to print. So I think in this period, the only things that are kind of still balanced are network news at 6:30. But if you're as hungry for news as I am in this fast-moving world, you're not just sticking with the network news. You're reading newspapers online the night before they appear in print. So I can't advise anyone. If they have time, I think they should use more than one source, and I think that's the safest course. And if that's the last question, I'll end with something that Thomas Jefferson said. Thomas Jefferson had two quotes. Well, he had many quotes about the press. One of them is when he was a grumpy old man. He said, the only paper I read now is the Richmond Examiner, and then only the advertisements, because the only thing you can believe in a newspaper these days are advertisements. And then he said, around the same time, the press is the toxin of liberty, meaning the only clarion bell, the only defense against tyranny. The toxin of liberty. And he also said, if I had to choose a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I would choose newspapers without government. So my recommendation is, I think we should take solace in the fact that we have a variety of opinion, even if it sometimes seems like a cacophony. It's preferable to state news and government-controlled news. And we're one of the few countries that still has an absolutely free press. So if it drives you crazy, count your blessings at the same time.